Hello, everybody. This is the Terrestrial Biome lecture. Hope you enjoy it. So, what we see is the Earth is covered in a variety of different climates. This is mainly due to solar energy, okay, where certain parts of the surface of the Earth collect more energy due to their orientation towards the sun. So, generally, what we see is right around the equator or in the tropical zone, which is just on either side of the equator, basically, gets the most sunlight. And there's above that, then there are temperate zones, and below that, there are temperate zones, and then, real Arctic conditions. But what makes the actual climates is an interaction, but I shouldn't say climates, the life zones that we call biomes is the interaction between two variables, that being temperature and precipitation. So if we look at, these are some of the biomes that we're going to talk about today. Deserts, right? Desert can be warm or it can be cold, but it doesn't have that much rainfall. Whereas tropical rainforests are always warm and have a whole lot of rain. So, basically this does a pretty good job of separating out the different biomes. Now, the way we can think about and show and express biomes is by looking at these things called climate diagrams. Now, what they're doing is they're putting temperature here on the y-axis and then the growing season on the x-axis. Oh, and also there's precipitation. So precipitation, water is in blue, temperature is in red. And so this is, remember, degrees Celsius, so this is freezing, okay? And whenever we see that the red line is below the blue line, that means that the plants are limited by the temperature. That means they're not going to be growing as much, not because there's not enough water, they're going to be not growing as much because it's not warm enough. The reverse that is if we have temperature above the water line, then what that means is the plants are limited by how much water there is. There's going to be a lot of evaporation. You're going to get a dry period whenever this red line is above that blue line. So across the world, we can have a map of these different biomes. I would spend some time looking at this map so that you can understand where these different biomes are. Even just North America is a pretty good job of showing us where these individual biomes are, because we have, I think, almost all of them in North America. So let's spend some time thinking about temperate rainforest. We're basically going to be going through all these, real quickly going through these different biomes that we have a general idea of. If later on in the class I talk about a deciduous forest, you all will know what I'm talking about. But a temperate rainforest is found on the west coast of North America, so right in here. Basically Oregon, Washington, British Columbia, and part into Alaska. In Chile, they'll find them way down here in Chile. And then in New Zealand, parts of New Zealand have this. And what we see is there's a whole lot of mountain, a whole lot of rain, essentially due to a thing called a rain shadow. But I'm not really going to go over that. But what we can think about Seattle, right? Seattle is known as this really rainy spot. And it's because this warm air comes off the ocean, goes up a mountain and cools down, and then dumps all the rain. And we get the tallest trees in the world here. These are where the redwoods, the giant sequoia trees. But there's plenty of really tall trees around here. The sequoias, those redwoods, will get up to 300 feet tall, just because there is so much water. And it's not. There's more water in a tropical rainforest, but since the temperature is colder, think about Seattle versus the middle of the Amazon rainforest. It's colder there, so there's less evaporation, so there's more maybe available water that isn't just continuously evaporating, but so that's why you can get these super tall trees. When we do think about a tropical rainforest, these really bright green color in here. The biggest one is going to be in South America, the Amazon rainforest, but Central America has a little bit of rainforest, Central Africa, and then the islands over here. And these are typical of the most amount of rain, right? So we've got really stable temperature, and the rain is always, there's plenty of rain in these rainforests. This is the most diverse habitat in the world. There's the most number of species that we find, and what that probably is due to is if you go to a rainforest, you'll notice that the environment is so three-dimensional. There's all sorts of things living everywhere, right? So if you go around here, sure, you find some squirrels in the trees, but that's really about it. Whereas if you were to look at a rainforest, like a pristine rainforest, there'll be trees, but then there'll be plants growing on those trees up in the air, and there'll be plants growing on those plants that are growing on the trees. It's crazy how many different species of plants that they have, and then the animals kind of follow along with that. So it is, there's the most diverse habitat, partly because there are so many trees, but then that kind of just snowballs from that to get more and more and more diversity. So let's move over to the least amount of water, biome, a desert. So deserts can be hot, they can be cold, right? So the Sahara Desert, in northern Africa, is quite warm, but there's plenty of deserts that are pretty cool. If you think about Mongolia, there's a high altitude desert in Mongolia, and kind of that western China area that has a lot of, there's just not a lot of rain that falls there. So you can have cold and hot deserts. What we see is the organisms that live there, though, have a lot of water conservation mechanisms, so that plants are like really tough, have really waxy coatings, and they're often really painful plants. They have a lot of feeding determinants, whether that's spines or some sort of chemicals that really prevent most of the species on the planet from being able to eat them. And what that's a response to is essentially, think about how hard it is to live in this desert. Now this is the Sonoran Desert in southern Arizona. There's more rain here than there is in, say, like the Sahara Desert, but still, it's still a really hard place to live, and it's hard to make a living if you're a plant there. So, and growth rates are really, really slow. So if you start growing a delicious plant that doesn't have any feeding deterrents, basically you're going to get eaten before you can even grow and reproduce. So a lot of the plants in deserts have lots of spines and painful things and poisons and chemicals that prevent anything from eating them, so that they have enough time to grow before, and they can reproduce before, some organism that has some sort of adaptation to be able to eat them. But it's kind of just an interesting thing about these harsh conditions in the desert. Now, grasslands. Grasslands, we see much more variable temperature. So we're in the temperate zones, in the yellow here, right? The interior of the U.S. has a very big grassland. The biggest one is the steppes of Asia, but then parts of Argentina here. You can't really see it on this small of a map, but that's where the biggest grasslands are. And what a grassland is it's mostly treeless. Now, why is it treeless? There's enough water to grow trees. The trees will grow, but the unique thing about grasslands is since there's a decent amount of time right here where you can see, it's actually not that much, but and this is in western North Dakota here, where you've got a late summer, early fall, where the temperature is higher than the water line, and then what can actually happen then is if you get a long drought one year, you can get a lot of fires. So the fires eliminate the trees, It's not the drought that does that. So you get grass being able to bounce back real quickly because most of their biomass is underground, whereas the trees are not able to bounce back from that fire. So if a repeated fires come in, they just kind of come in, kill all the trees, come in, kill all the trees every couple of years when they have these fires. Another really interesting biome that is really common with fire is the Chaparral. It's also known as the Mediterranean climate. So if you think about all of Spain and Portugal, all of Italy, all of Greece, Morocco, and parts of Libya are in that. But then we also have the southern California, and a good portion of Argentina is Chaparral. So these are characterized by wet, cool winters and then very hot and very dry summers. So these plants have a little bit different types of adaptations. They have this really weird kind of bark that can deal with getting burned for a little bit. So there's these really interesting plants that can deal with these fires in a different way. Sure, all their leaves burn up, but they can grow relatively quickly new leaves after the fire. Unfortunately, very little of this is left undisturbed. So we go back to this map, pretty much all of Southern California, right? Los Angeles, that's where everybody lives. Spain, Italy, Greece have had people for thousands of years, civilization for a long time. So there's really not that much chaparral left there. There is some in Argentina just because it's a little bigger area of it. But all right, the next one is the Temperate Broadleaf Forest, also known as a deciduous forest. Here we have enough water, right? So the water line is always above the temperature line. It can get relatively cold. We can think of this as kind of like the eastern United States. A good portion of Europe would be in this. And trees can grow relatively tall just because they have all of that water. Unfortunately, a lot of this has been really cut down. There's not that much native temperate broadleaf forest left in the world. Just because two main places, Europe and then the eastern United States, have been so heavily impacted by people. But they've actually recovered relatively well. There's still, a regrown forest can still have a decent amount of original species and cool things going on. As we move north, though, we get to the Coniferous Forest, also known as the taiga. Taiga. The coniferous forest is found at high altitudes, so like on the tops of mountains, and high latitudes. So I should say that again. High altitudes up on mountains, and high latitudes either very far north or very far south. We actually don't find any in the southern hemisphere just because there isn't land far enough south in it, actually. It's all ocean there. You need to get to the south of Australia before you would be able to have any big areas of taiga. So the cold winters eliminate the deciduous trees. So if you think about why this is, it has to do with their short growing season. So this is in extreme northern Minnesota. Their growing season is really only April through October, whereas here, in this other places that more where we find the temperate broadleaf forest, you'll see growing seasons from March through November. But the reason why pine trees, coniferous trees, will be able to dominate in these areas has to do with the growing seasons. So think about an oak tree, right? Oak tree is the leaves take a long time to grow. So if it were in this place in northern Minnesota and an oak tree, the leaves might take a month to grow through, not be ready until mid-May. And then it would have part of May, June, July, and August to grow. But then the leaves would have to start falling off before it gets to winter. Whereas think about a pine tree that's in this area. The pine tree has those needles all year round, and those are the leaves of a pine tree. So the needles, as soon as that gets warm enough, and as soon as there's enough sunlight that it's able to do its photosynthesis, it's going to be able to do that, and it's going to basically start doing its thing right away as soon as the conditions are right, rather than having to wait for its leaves to regrow. Also, needles do a really good job of not collecting as much snow. The snow kind of just falls off the trees, and they can save a lot of water because of their waxy coatings. So, and then in the extreme northern, so if you look at just what we talked about, taiga would kind of be, down here at Lake Superior and up north and all of this area up here. But tundra then can be at extremely high altitudes, so on the very tippy top of mountains, and the extremely high latitudes, very far up north. And what we see is the ground is permanently frozen. So once you go down a couple feet in the tundra, the ground will be frozen all year round. There's a ton of wind. The wind is extremely strong here. And if plants grow very much tall at all, the winds will dry them out and kill them. So what we see is it's kind of dominated by a bunch of little shrubby things, grasses, and then lichens. That's what reindeer caribou are actually eating. They're going to be eating mostly lichens that are growing around really close to the ground. And what we can see here is pretty much it's very, very cold. Average temperature below zero for most of the year, below freezing for most of the year, and only a very short couple months of growing season. And then, up here, as you get even more north, that growing season might only be just maybe 2 months, if that. So, that is all of the biomes. Hope you enjoyed it, and see you all at the next lecture.